Okay, everybody. Everybody good? We're ready to start. Hello, Paul.
G'day, Pat. How you going?
Hey, not too bad. Not too bad. Thank you very much. There we go.
Nice to be with you this evening.
Big hand by everybody. Yeah, there we go. You probably can't hear that, but you can see the language. Okay, I think the volume is good. So I'll
Okay,
kick off now if that's okay. Paul, just do your intro and then we can
sure.
oh. Okay, let me just pull it out. The 17 pages I wrote about you. Okay,
Nice.
first of all, so welcome today, August 20th, 2025, and welcome to Samui Real session 206. Woohoo! Hey, stop it. Thank you. Okay, so today is actually is a Zoom talk, as you can see, by second-time guest, international best-selling author, theological educator, and researcher, Paul Wallis. So Paul Anthony Wallis is an internationally best-selling author whose books probe the world's ancestral narratives for their insight into human origins, human potential, and our place in the cosmos. As a senior churchman, Paul served for 33 years as church doctor, a theological educator, and an archdeacon in the Anglican Church in Australia. Paul's acclaimed Eden series, endorsed by Harvard's Professor Avi Loeb, George Norrie, and Erich von Däniken, has made him the go-to guy in the field of paleocontact, which is what we call this area, paleocontact. As host of the Fifth Kind TV, El Quinto Tipo, and the Paul Wallis channel, Paul's documentaries and interviews are watched by over 15 million people worldwide. So I mentioned a few names here, Avi Loeb. So you'll notice that he's one of the astrophysicists that talk about, extraterrestrial craft coming into our solar system. George Norrie is the current host of a well-known program called Coast to Coast AM, which is a program that was started, I believe, in 1988 by a guy called Art Bell. It was taken over in 2003 by George Norrie. Now, this program is absolutely interesting. I believe Paul is very close with these guys, and they talk a lot about paranormal, UFO, and other interesting stuff. Erich von Däniken is the father of ufology or UFOs. He's 90 years old now. He wrote a book called Chariots. Is it Chariots of the Fire? Is that right?
Chariots of the Gods.
Just testing you guys. Nice one, which sold about 68 million copies, just testing them worldwide. Okay, so Paul's first talk to us was on May 10th, 2023, session 105. And the title was, is the original Bible story really talking about ancient aliens and not about a monotheistic God as we are led to believe? Fascinating. So he spoke then about recent alternative interpretations of human origins as written in the Bible. And he probed into a new understanding amongst some Hebrew scholars, suggesting strong evidence for paleocontact between humans of old and other extraterrestrial beings. And tonight, Paul will start with his recent findings in Turkey and then set that in the context of his journey in ancestral narratives and biblical translations, structuring it around three major archaeological finds in Turkey in 2025, the Seal of Yehoezer in Jerusalem in 2024, and the Naus of Asherah in 1948 in Palestine to create a fascinating geological tour just for us. So everybody, if you'd like to put your hands together and welcome Paul Wallis. Thank you, Paul.
Well, thank you everyone for having me this evening. It's way past my usual bedtime. So if my energy seems to start flagging, please don't take it personally. It's just my circadian rhythm. But I think the energy of your room is going to pep me up this evening as we share this information together, reflect on it, do some Q&A. Thank you, Pat, for the introduction. And yes, you're quite right. I have been lately in Turkey. I've traveled there twice in the last few months. I'll be going out again next month, taking people on tour. And my latest book in the Eden series focuses on what we have found in the Van province, the Van region of Turkey. And this book here, The Eden Enigma, is the one that focuses on that area. And I'm going to show you this image because we're going to come back to it in just a moment. And the subtitle of this book is Do Ancient Carvings in the Mountains of Turkey carry memories of ET contact from the dawn of civilization. And if you heard my previous talk, you can probably guess what my answer is to that question. But before we get to Turkey, I want to start with something that happened while I was writing that book, The Eden Enigma. So this is 2024. I'm busy penning the 6th volume in the Eden series when something happened in the news that absolutely blew me away because it was a real world, tangible piece of evidence pointing to everything I've been talking about in the series that Pat just mentioned. My understanding that the Bible might very well have some stories in it about God, but a lot of the stories in it we've interpreted as God's stories may in fact be mistranslations of our ancestors' experience of something quite different. And I argue, particularly in my book, The Eden Conspiracy, that when we read the ancient Hebrew texts a little more closely and go to more rootsy interpretations of the words, go to the root meanings of the key words, a different story emerges that places the Yahweh character, whom we've translated as God, among a whole number of entities washing around in the text, entities called Elohim. And then all of a sudden, last year in Jerusalem, there surfaced this artifact near Temple Mount. This artifact was retrieved and it was announced the seal of Jehoazer. What's one of those? Well, this was a seal that belonged to a senior Jewish official in the 8th century BCE. So he would use it to seal his letters, to solemnize documents. He was the kind of official who you'd go to kind of as a JP, who would, witness your documents, make them legally binding, do your stat decks, and he would use this seal to show, I, Jehoazer, solemnize this contract or whatever it might be. And so there's this little imprint that he would put into wax, and now you know it's all official. The seal of Jehoazer. What design do you suppose he would have on it, the senior Jewish official, to show that this document that he had just put his name to was legitimate? Would it surprise you if I said the image looked exactly like that? Why would that be a surprise? Why would that grab my attention? Well, first off, of course, because of the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments begin with a command from Yahweh, the God of the Jewish religion, that you must not bow to or serve or even depict any other Elohim, any other powerful ones. So you're not allowed to serve them, work for them, talk about them, draw pictures of them. And yet this senior Jewish official has a picture of one on his seal for solemnizing his documents. How could that possibly be? How could it be that a senior Jewish official would not know the Ten Commandments? And so it immediately raised the question of, did they not know the Ten Commandments in the 8th century BCE? So when were those written? When did they become known? When did they become important to Judaism? Because it certainly wasn't important to the Judaism of the 8th century BCE in Jerusalem at the time of Jehoazer. And then not only has Jehoazer depicted one of the other Elohim, the other powerful ones, but he's chosen one that isn't Yahweh. So immediately we realize that in the world of Jehoazer, if he even knew about Yahweh, Yahweh was one of a whole number of beings, and he'd picked another one to be the image that he would solemnize his documents with. This might all seem very strange, And certainly the Jewish scholars who presented the find to the world felt some word of explanation was needed for this. And what they said to the press was, this design clearly shows the strong Assyrian influence on 8th century Judaism. Well, that would be the understatement of the age. It does a great deal more than show an Assyrian influence. Archaeologists would describe that figure as an Assyrian genie. Genie is a word for an advanced being or a small g god that historians and archaeologists like to use, but it was very clear to them they were looking at part of the Assyrian pantheon of powerful beings, and that Jehoazer had no problem depicting one of those and using that as his symbol of authority. So, how could it happen? How could a senior Jewish official not see any conflict between this choice and his Jewish faith? And the answer really is in the date that we were able to date this artifact to the 8th century BCE. And that is before the reforms that turned Judaism into the monotheistic religion we all know it as today. So, what was it before? In the Eden series, I show that it was a canon of cultural memory that included a whole number of interesting beings, beings more powerful than human beings who governed over human beings. They governed over territories and lands. I'm talking about figures like Chemosh, Dagon, Milcom, Yahweh, El Shaddai, El of the Amorites, El of Ekron, El of Egypt. These were all the Elohim who conflicted with one another over that region and whose bit was whose and how it should be run. The Bible recalls their arrival as the Tseva Hashemayim, which we can translate as the skyborn armies or the sky fleet. And then they governed over humanity as the Ba'adat El, the powers in council. So these plural beings. And Judaism was a memory of that. And some of the memories were negative and some were positive. They had memories of a female entity called Asherah, which were far more positive. And the stories around Asherah were of an advanced being who came and taught their ancestors agricultural science, how to turn naturally occurring plants into cultivatable crops so you can create farms, have surpluses, become a settled society, a specialized society, and build a civilization. These were all the stories that mashed together to form the cultural memory of the tribes of Israel. But then the reforms happened, beginning in the 8th century BCE, just after the time of Jehoazer. And what happened was a king came along called Hezekiah. And among all the great pantheon of these beings, he picked one that was his god, and it was the god Yahweh, a war god, a storm god. And whether it was his idea or the idea of his high priest Hilkiah, the idea came along that perhaps all the people in his kingdom should worship the same God he worshipped. And the high priest certainly had a good reason to suggest this to the king, because all these temples scattered throughout the Levant represented a whole number of priesthoods. People would go to those priesthoods for soothsaying, for a word of divine wisdom, for an understanding of the law, for the resolution of conflicts. They would go with their money and make their offerings and pay their tithes. And so there was a great distribution of wealth throughout the kingdom and a great distribution of power in terms of providing narratives and meaning and beliefs to the people of the tribes of Israel, the tribes of Judah. And so Hilkiah the high priest said, Sire, would it not make more sense if your people worship the same God you do, and we have only one high priesthood, the high priesthood of Yahweh, and we have only one temple, the Jerusalem temple, and we have only one coffer to which all the tithes of the nation should come, because then we've got a theocratic society honoring your God, one king, one high priest, one temple, one place to which all the tithes come, one ministry of truth, telling everyone what to believe. Of course, that's me, sire, and my family. So you could see why it would be a good idea for Hilkiah, and you can probably see why Hezekiah might think it was a good idea too. If you pick a violent God, of course, you can justify violence to maintain control over your realm and to invade other people's territories. Let's do it, says Hezekiah. And so they embark on a ritual reform, which meant sending the armies into the Jerusalem temple to deface all the carvings showing the images of the Tseva Hashemayim, showing Yahweh and all the other Elohim and what they looked like, to destroy the Nehushtan, which was an image of Yahweh, showing the people what he looked like. So they did that within the Jerusalem temple, and then the other temples, well, they broke the horns off the altars, they broke the figurines that were used in commemorative activities, and at times they slaughtered all the priests who knew these other stories, who provided this other layer of news and soothsaying and prophetic meaning and teaching to the people. So a great power grab, essentially, of wealth and narrative control and political control. That was the reform that started happening just after the time of Jehoiakim. And it was actually in the generation of Hezekiah's grandson, Josiah, that the Hebrew scriptures started gathering together, being glued together, and then rewritten, and then put forward in the time of Ezra, as this will now be the book that defines the beliefs of the people of Israel. And so it is much later that all of a sudden there's a book with the Ten Commandments in it. So it's very likely that Jehoiakim had never heard of the Ten Commandments, didn't know what they were. They may not have been written, or they might not have been brought into anything that Jewish people would know as a Bible or a set of scriptures. And there's a great lack of information, really, about the formation of the canon of the Hebrew scriptures, where they all came from, when they came together. We really only have fragments from about the 6th century BCE on, and it's not until 900 in the Common Era, 1000 in the Common Era, before you've got a book that we might now recognize as the Hebrew Scriptures or the Old Testament. So it all came together rather piecemeal. But Jehoiakim lived before any of that, and lived at a time when he was free to pick an Assyrian genie as the symbol of his legitimacy and authority. So it was a little window onto that time when the people of Israel remembered the genies. They remembered the advanced beings. They remembered the Elohim, and they remembered what they looked like. They remembered that they looked like this. They looked like people, but with wings, which must mean something. And a lot of them did have this pine cone and this bucket that they went around with. And it's only as we get into the Babylonian stories, from which the Bible takes many of its stories, and into Assyrian stories, and into stories that I found in Turkey and in modern day Armenia, that we begin to understand what those symbols mean, what the pine cone is, what the bucket is. But it was a very well-known image at that time. So from Jerusalem, we'll take a trip out to Nablus, Palestine, and to Tel El Farah. And this was the place that Pat mentioned, where in 1948 they dug up this object called a naus. Now, a naus is a doorway with no building. It's not attached to a building. There's nothing around it, and there's nothing behind it for you to walk into. It is just a doorway all on its own, with symbology on it indicating who the being was who had come through this mystical doorway. Now, what they found in Tel Al Farar represented a whole trove in that period. Tel Arad was another place nearby where they found objects used in devotional activity at harvest festivals. And they found these figurines of Ashura, this female being who is credited with being the bringer of agriculture, the bringer of medicine, the person who taught our ancestors in the deep past how to farm and become a civilization. And at the harvest festivals, she would be honored with foods made from corn, which would be eaten in the streets as part of the festival. There'd be incense offerings. The figurines would be carried into the temple for a service of thanksgiving. And under Hezekiah and Hilkiah, all that had to be stamped out. And so what we've dug up are the ruined remains of those activities. So the figurines all have their heads broken off. The altars have the horns broken off. Figurines have been removed from the naos. That sort of thing has gone on to try and obliterate the activity and the memory of this being Asherah. There are little symbols on that doorway that represent Asherah. So inverted palm trees represent Asherah. And then there's a little star map above the doorway indicating where Asherah came from. A crescent and a number of stars. And what we're looking at is the bull constellation and the stars of the Pleiades. And so the message here is that Asherah was an advanced being who gifted us with these amazing things. She was not human. She came from the Pleiades in the deep past, and we will remember her with affection. That was the message. That was what had to be stamped out so that there would only be one God, this Yahweh figure. But what was she? Was she just a story? The other ones, Dagon, Chemosh, Milcom, were they just stories? Were they invented figures? I wonder what the purpose might have been of inventing these figures. And certainly from the viewpoint of the Hebrew scribes, it was a very inconvenient aspect of Jewish memory. Asherah was not just a devotional object, and the cult of Asherah couldn't be destroyed just by breaking the objects. And what happens in the book of Jeremiah shows us how Judaism went about trying to shift the narrative away from a memory of Paleocontact and into the territory of a monotheistic religion. It was quite clear from what the author of the book of Jeremiah did that it was impossible to stamp out the memory of Asherah. It simply was known at a grassroots level, and she was remembered positively at a grassroots level. And so what the writer of Jeremiah has to do is change the lens through which we see those stories, put a spin on it so that we will process that memory differently. And so the writer of Jeremiah has to acknowledge that on every high hill and under every green tree, from every garrison to every fortified town, Asherah was commemorated. And he repeats this, and the writer of 1 and 2 Kings uses that same phrase as well to say this was Jewish practice in the 8th to 7th century BCE. This was the figure that everybody remembered with thanksgiving, not Yahweh, but Asherah. And in fact, they talked very negatively about the time when they were under the direct rule of Yahweh. You might know the story from 1 Samuel 15, where the tribes of Israel attempt to get rid of Yahweh because they don't like being governed by him and his prophets. And they say, we don't want any more of this. we're going to have human leaders for human society henceforth. And they get rid of him. They viewed him very negatively. In fact, they regarded him as a monster. And Jeremiah, when he wrote his book, said that that memory had persisted, that the popular report of Yahweh was negative. What an awful figure he was, and how wonderful Asherah was. This was the actual belief and practice. And so, what Jeremiah had to do was to acknowledge the cultural memory on every high hill, under every green tree, from every fortified town to every garrison. Asherah is commemorated. And then he just adds a phrase: isn't that awful? Isn't that idolatrous? And so he's acknowledged the memory, but he's now telling everyone what to think about that memory. And that was how they tried to deal with it. The writers couldn't deny that the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah had acknowledged all these other beings, these other advanced beings. They couldn't deny that kings like Manasseh and kings as great as Solomon had installations built to Asherah, had employed Jewish priesthoods to perform rituals to give thanks to Asherah and Chemosh and Milcom. They even had installations within the Jerusalem temple. They couldn't deny this. This was an inconvenient memory. And so, again, what the writers do in the Bible is to acknowledge the memory and then put a spin on it. And so they'll say Solomon constructed all these installations to these other beings. It was because he had foreign wives. It's because his wives weren't Jewish. That's where they went wrong. So they've acknowledged what's happened, and then they've told you what to think about it. But there's a funny thing going on here, because there's a difference between the narrator and the author. Because the narrator of Jeremiah would have us all forget that there were ever these other beings being mentioned and honored. The narrator wishes we didn't know anything about it. The author has guaranteed we will never forget Asherah and Chemosh and Dagon and Milcom and all the others. So you have to wonder exactly what's happening and the speed at which this cultural shift was being expected by the powers on high. And you wonder if everyone really was keeping up with this shift. Indeed, if you travel through the world of Eastern Orthodoxy, you will often find an olive tree in the courtyard in front of an Eastern Orthodox church. That is the modern way of commemorating Asherah. It has survived through Judaism and through Christianity. It has been more persistent than the power of some of these reforms that were put through all these years ago. And it's one of the things that makes me think these are not just invented stories that could be put into a book or taken out. There really was a cultural memory of contact with these beings, and the memory was so strong at the grassroots that even the reformers couldn't get rid of it. They just had to put a spin on it to try and put it to one side so that we could now be good monotheistic Yahwists for king and country. Now I come to Turkey and I consider how the stories there relate to the stories that I've studied in the Bible. In the Bronze Age, there was a people group living in what today we call Turkey, called the Biaynili. This is how they refer to themselves, the Biaynili. They're known as the Urartian people. Urartu is the local way of saying Ararat. In the Bible, it's Ararat. And of course, originally, when you wrote in Hebrew, there were no vowels. It was just RRT in effect. And Urartu, Ararat, they're the same word. It's the high country. It's the high country where, according to Genesis, Noah's craft ran aground after the deluge. It's the high country where, according to Babylonian legend, the Ark of Ziusudra ran aground. It's, according to Moses Koronatzi, the 5th century historian of Armenia, the place from which humanity was rebooted after the last catastrophe. It's just north of where the ancient Persians said society was rebooted after a great and terrible winter. This is the story of Yamshid Jima. And there are many vectors pointing to this part of the world, suggesting that there was a very significant reboot of human civilization in this region. So in 1998, for instance, Manfred Hoyne went into southeast Turkey with a team from the University of Norway in Aarhus and the Max Planck Institute, and were able to identify what is believed to be the first known farm of modern civilization at a place called Karajada, where 11 naturally occurring plants were modified, and I mean gene modification, to turn them into cultivatable crops. And in this very localized area, not only did the family or tribe living there work out how to do that, they suddenly worked out how to do animal husbandry as well. And that information then spread from there into the Baltic states, through Northern Europe, into Scandinavia. And that migration is referenced in the 1200s by Snorri Sturluson, who was the historian through whom we know all the Norse stories of the Norse gods, the Aesir, Odin, Thor, and all of those. They were an advanced society, said Snorri Sturluson, who came from Assaland, what we would call ancient Armenia, and brought all those skills with them, conquering Northern Europe and Scandinavia and Iceland with ease in the process. The Biainili have left behind them, they were there in the Bronze Age 3,000 years ago, they've left behind them inscriptions in cuneiform and symbols that refer back to that deep story. And in my book, which I'll flash once again if you don't mind, The Eden Enigma, I go through these symbols and I argue for an interpretation of them that says these symbols, these inscriptions left behind by the kings, Sarduli the second, Rusa the second, Argisti the first, the inscriptions they leave behind, the carvings they make, all speak about a recovery of human society after a cataclysm. The symbols all imply a silent spring, if I can use Rachel Carson's phrase, to refer to a period where agriculture had ground to a halt, where the land was infertile, where the land was barren, and certain helpers came alongside our ancestors to help us relaunch the ecosphere. Something was missing that meant we couldn't get our crops to grow and to pollinate and to fruit and to harvest. And if you've ever wondered what it was these Assyrian genies, or the Tingir, as the Biainili call them, were doing with this little device and this little bucket, that sometimes it's a handbag, sometimes it's a pine cone, sometimes it's a cypress leaf. When you get into Turkey and Armenia and look closely at the symbology, it shows that they are tending plants which are portrayed in, one could say, almost laboratory-like conditions. They're not growing and thriving in the wild. They're in some kind of a nursery or a lab, and they're being cross-pollinated. And we've got advanced winged beings showing regular human beings how to do it. It's a story in which we were shown how to introduce plants and crops from other places into this devastated environment and get those plants talking to each other again and pollinating, cross-pollinating, and once again creating harvests and moving into farming and modern agricultural science. That's the deep story told by the Biainili people. It's told in the installations left behind in Turkey and in the installations left behind in Armenia. Now, what I find interesting about that story is we tend to tell the stories of ancient cultures in language that distorts the stories that they've left behind. So archaeologists, historians would say, the Tingir, they, of course, were the gods of the Urartian people, the gods of the Biainili. Or you might say to an archaeologist, so what is an Assyrian genie? Well, it's a kind of a small g god. But as soon as we use the word God, we've distorted the story because in the English language, if I use the word God, we immediately think of an almighty, spiritual, transcendent, probably imagined being. And that's not what the Biainili meant by Tingir at all. And it's not what the Assyrians meant by genies. And it's not what the Babylonians meant by Apkallu. I mean, we can go all around the world and say actually they didn't speak English. And this is not a fair translation of what they're telling us. In the case of the Biainili, what we're being told is that there were beings with advanced but finite powers. They did not have the power to stop the chaos and devastation of an ice age, but they did have the technology to help us reboot agriculture and the aftermath of it. They were finite beings who were here at a particular time, for a finite time, teaching a particular generation particular skills, those of agricultural science, and then they left. That's the story. Not almighty, not spiritual, not transcendent, and possibly not imagined. Advanced others who helped us at a particular time. That's what our ancestors told us. And we really hope they might come again one day for a little bit more technology sharing. And I think when we get down to these stories and start saying what they actually said instead of layering our own language over the top, the language of God, the language of divinity, the language of magic, only then can we begin to process what we've been told and decide what we think about it, but we have to understand it first. And so, looking at the clock, let me look at my notes here. I'll just say that these stories echo around the world, whether we're thinking about the Asherah story that is part of the biblical narrative, or the stories of Tingir, such as we find in Turkey, or the Assyrian genies celebrated by our Jewish official in the 8th century BCE, Yehoezer, or if we come to Australia and listen to the stories of the Yolngu people who talk about the Mimi spirits teaching their ancestors agriculture, or if we listen to the Zulu story from Baba Mwana Warisa, the female entity who taught their entities how to farm and how to make beer. If we listen to the Babylonian story of Oannes and the Apkallu, what we're hearing is overlap after overlap, correlation after correlation. And for me, it was discovering the correlations of story all around the world that made me stop and ask some fresh questions. Because in my evangelical youth, I'd always read the Bible in a bubble, and I'd taken it as the truth against the world. And so I was happy to affirm anybody else insofar as they agreed with my reading of the Bible. And if they had any other story, well, that's not true if it contradicts what I've got in my book, because this is the truth. Now that I've made a journey around the world and sat at the feet of the elders of indigenous traditions, read texts that belong to other cultures, I've realized the biblical stories are part of a much wider family of story. The biblical stories are part of the family of Middle Eastern stories. They are a retelling of Babylonian and Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyrian story. There are overlaps with ancient Persian story, what became Zoroastrian story. You can go to Mesoamerica, you can go to North Europe, you can go to Scandinavia, you can go to West Africa, you can go to the top end of Australia, you can go to PNG, and you'll find the stories overlap at very interesting points. And the points at which they overlap are points of trauma in the human story. And it's those memories of trauma and those overlaps that have made me take a pause and learn to ask different questions when I come to these stories. In the past, it would be true or false. Does it match the Bible or is it against it? Now I ask, what memory have these stories been crafted to curate? And what might we learn from that memory? So I'll pause there and I'm happy to go into a conversation of Q&A. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Paul. Sorry, can someone get the lights on that side, please? Can we have the lights? I'll just turn the lights on, Paul. Okay, absolutely fascinating. I myself have so many questions myself, but there are other people in the room. I would like to ignore them and just ask all the questions myself, but I will ask the first question. So for those who are new, in the group, can you just first tell us when you started to question what you learned at seminary school, everything you learned when you were 33 years in the ministry? What is it? I heard it was an accident. And how long were you laid up? And what was it that instigated you to start on this journey?
Oh gosh, it was really lots of things. I think the way I came to faith as a Christian believer was deeply helpful for me because my initial views of Christianity were quite negative and were formed when I was about 5 years old. And I still remember a Monday morning when I would have been no more than five, when the principal of our school said, Mrs. Clark's class are going to come in, they're going to teach us a new hymn. Mrs. Clark was the one teacher at our school who could play the piano, so she always taught the new hymns. And so her class taught this hymn that began with the words, When Jesus was a little boy. And the hymn went on to say, When Jesus was a little boy, he was good as gold. He never gave his parents any trouble, always did what he was told, and he always obeyed his teachers too. And so, children, should you. And that was the hymn. And I sat there at 5 years old thinking, this is pathetic. I could see exactly what they're doing. They're just trying to get us to behave, and they've hijacked this Jesus to try and sort of threaten us into being good children. They must think we're stupid. And I remember going home and repeating this to my dad. And I said, these teachers, they talk about God as if they've seen God. They haven't seen, they've never met him. They don't know. For all they know, God could be a giant green dragon. And my dad was reading a paper at the time and he just said something like, yes, I'm sure you're right, Paul. And that was his response. But that was my earliest opinion. So, I mean, at the age of 5, I formed a pretty shrewd understanding that what an institution has to say about Jesus and any actual historical Jesus could be two quite different things. And I was watching in front of me how an institution might distort what Jesus really was for its own advantage. And so when I when I became a Christian, it was I could really only do that by recognizing that there's clear blue water between the figure of Jesus himself and the teachings of Jesus and any claims made on his behalf by others. There's clear blue water between Jesus and the credibility of an institution. And so I went in with that kind of an eye that meant that if I was given an inadequate answer, I wouldn't be fobbed off with that. And pretty quickly, I was recognizing that a lot of my questions weren't getting adequate answers. Why in the church do we spend all our resources organizing church services when there's no mention of church services in the gospel? Jesus didn't put any services on. He did other things. So why we never got a good answer to that? Why do we treat the Bible as if it's been dictated verbatim by God? How do we form that view of it? Why do we see it that way? Never got a good answer to that. Why do we teach that anyone who doesn't become a Christian is going to be tortured for eternity by God as a punishment when I don't quite see that in the gospel? Never got a good answer to that. And those were the questions that I went to seminary with. And I made it a personal goal of mine, for instance, to scrutinized the doctrine of hell in my 3 years at seminary to work out if it really was in the gospel. And I came away believing, no, it isn't. There's something else in the gospel that the church has distorted. And once you've taken that out of the matrix, it really gives you a lot of freedom to be agnostic about a lot of things, because now your eternal salvation doesn't rest on agreeing with a list of fundamental truths. So as a teacher, I was always very conscious of um, what's in the scriptures and what the familiar doctrines are, and not bluffing when there's a difference between the two. So that was always a part of my faith. But you referred to my ultimate frisbee injury, and I really was injured in a game of ultimate frisbee, which had quite long-term effects. But in my book, Escaping from Eden, I use it as a kind of a code for all the times when the universe has gifted me with time to go back and look at some of these stories we tell that don't make sense, or some of these bits of the Bible that I thought, there's something else going on there. And so there were all these things in the background for a long time that I thought must go back and look at that. But then it was finally about 7 years ago that I said, no, I actually need to pursue all this to its logical conclusion and share what I find. And I was prompted to do that by the Roman Catholic Church, actually, when it held its colloquium in 2009, and we had very significant voices for the Curia suddenly coming out and saying there were ETs in the Bible. And I thought, how could I have missed that? So when I had the time afforded me by my ultimate frisbee accident, that was one of the things I wanted to go and check out. Could I really have missed something as glaring as aliens in the Bible? And I found, yes, I had missed it, and the Bible's full of them.
Wow, amazing. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to someone else, or else I'll just take it back. Sorry, Paul first and then Pierre.
Hi, Paul. Great presentation. Thanks very much. Very entertaining, very informative. The advanced wing beings, where do you think they came from and where do you think they went to?
Yes, great question. Um, I mentioned that in Ashura we've got references to the Pleiades when we start looking at archaeological evidence. In the Bible, there are three regions of space that are referred to as exercising some kind of power dynamic over what happens on Earth, and that's the Pleiades, Orion, and Sirius. And it's in arguably the oldest book that's made its way into the Hebrew canon, and a lot of Bible scholars believe it's Arabic literature at root. That's the book of Job. And so when I came across that verse, Orion, Sirius, Pleiades, I raised an eyebrow or two, because those were three regions of space that I was hearing referenced in indigenous story around the world relating to our ancient helpers. So the Pleiades you'll find in ancestral story from New Zealand and Australia and Native America as the point of origin of those who helped us learn agriculture a long, 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 long time ago, more than 60,000 years ago. And they're very, very similar stories of a very similar character of tuition, a tuition that helps us live in balance with the environment and to farm the environment in a way that's self-renewing. So the Pleiades gets mentioned quite a few times in that connection. In Armenia, there is a space observatory that is being dated by the mainstream academic archaeologists at 12,000 years before present. What's incredibly exciting about that is that that suggests civilization on the other side of the most recent ice age, which is something we know next to nothing about, except we've got this megalithic site at Karahunj in Armenia, which is all oriented on Cygnus. They were all very interested. I think it was 1998 when the Armenian archaeologists worked out it was oriented on Cygnus. 1984, they worked out it was an observatory, and it had been developed so carefully that there are actually contours in the viewfinding stone so that you can lie in them comfortably, look through the viewfinder, and you'll be looking at a particular star. So that orientation I find intriguing. I don't know many Cygnus stories, but they must have had a reason to be interested in that part of the sky. And I do note that the stories in um, the um, the annals of the Aesir do have stories that suggest beings coming from Cygnus. That gets my attention because of the connection that Snorri Sturluson mentions of the Aesir having come from Armenia and therefore having taken their stories with them. And Snorri Sturluson pointed to evidence in language of that great migration, which we're beginning to track now, not only linguistically, but in DNA research as well. So I would mention those four regions of space. Pleiades keeps getting repeated. Orion, also Sirius. The stories from Sirius are a bit more mixed. Some suggest people coming and helping. Some suggest us being colonized by beings from Sirius. And then we've got Cygnus, where I'm just beginning to read up on the stories from there. But what's interesting about the Pleiadian stories, the Bianili stories of the Tingir, is this aspect of how finite a time it was that they were here. They were here for a short time and then they went home. But if I listen to the Bianili story, it kind of makes sense that they just came to help us in a moment when our survival hung in the balance. And that's not dissimilar to what we do for one another when each other's countries are suddenly hit by typhoons, tornadoes, massive flooding. We do go into each other's countries um, to help each other get back on our feet. And I just wonder if it was something like that that was reported in the story of the Tingir and the stories of the genies.
Thank you, Paul, for the question. Thank you, Paul, for the answer. As for the second part of Paul's question, where do you think they went? Do you think they returned to their...
Yeah, I think they just went home.
Oh.
And I think similarly for some of the less positive stories that we can read, such as the stories of the Anunnaki in the Babylonian stories and some of the Elohim stories in the Hebrew scriptures. These are stories of beings who came, divided up the land. They were interested in possession of the land and the minerals under the land. And I think we could liken that to what we do to each other's countries when we invade one another's countries. And so if I think of what happened in the land of my fathers, on my father's side, Ghana, Britain sort of got control of Ghana beginning in the 1820s and established its presence there with a visible military force. They overwhelmed the local population with their arsenal of weaponry and took over the army, the police, the education department, the government, the land agency, and they ran the country by force for a period. But once they had set the commodity prices, once they'd issued the monopolies, once they'd set up the banking systems and set up the exchange rates, the British found they could go home and still benefit from all the arrangements they'd set in place in the time when they were physically in Ghana. And I wonder if we've got stories a little bit like that when we get to the Babylonian stories of Anunnaki and the Hebrew stories of Elohim, that they came physically for a finite period and then went home, but found ways of benefiting even in absentia. And that is part of the Yahweh story in the Bible, if you follow it from 1 Samuel 15 on. Even though they got rid of him, sacked him, replaced him with human kings, they still had to pay tribute to him to avoid him interfering.
Got it. Thank you so much. Thank you. Tom, for Pia first. Yeah.
Hi there, I'm Pia. I'm Norwegian, and
Hi, Pia.
hi, and I've been studying this for years myself. And I'm just wondering if you are of the well, same opinion as me that we've been, as we are today, Homo sapiens sapiens, for like a long time, and we've been seated here.
We were seated here, did you say?
Yeah.
Yes, yes. That's a great question. I mean, there's a lot about Homo sapiens that's very odd in terms of us, how we fit within the ecosystem on planet Earth. We are ill adapted to the environment. I mean, if you or I were left in the wilderness, after 3 days, 3 nights, we would probably be sick, deceased, or in some other way in trouble. Unless we were a survivalist, the only way we can survive is by building a shelter, creating a weapon, lighting a fire. So our only edge in even surviving, let alone becoming the alpha species, is our intelligence, which is so different to that of all the other animals on the planet. And this is an anomaly that has yet to be adequately explained. And as a young boy, certainly as an 11-year-old boy, I remember thinking there's a huge gap in our ability to explain ourselves. For instance, we're supposed to be omnivores, but if we eat raw flesh of animals, we'll get very sick and we could die. A lion doesn't get sick or die of uh, eating raw flesh. So what's going on there? And then we have to boil half our vegetables so we don't poison ourselves. What's going on there? And then half of us have allergies against things in our natural environment. What's going on there? We really don't seem very well adapted to the planet. And I mentioned the Yolngu people in Australia, Australia's top end. The Aboriginal people of Australia are renowned for their skill in living in balance with the environment. And yet, their oldest story of the Yolngu people is the story of the Mimi, who came to their ancestors at a time when their ancestors didn't know what was good to eat and what was good to avoid. They didn't know how to fish or to hunt or to survive in the land. How come? How could they suddenly find themselves in an environment they didn't understand, didn't know how to live in, didn't know how to survive in? And so stories like that serve no purpose, if you think about it. I mean, why would you invent that story that does not honor your people, doesn't honor your elders? It's a very odd story. It honors beings who aren't there anymore, the Mimi being. What's the point of that story? It does suggest a memory of a time where something changed, either about us or about our environment. And both those aspects are found in ancient stories. So if we go to Zulu story, we've got the story of Unkulunkulu, which would support exactly what you're saying, Pia, that we came from somewhere else. Or you can go to Sumerian and Babylonian story that said, no, actually, we were developing quite naturally on planet Earth, but then visitors came and they adapted us to be more intelligent so that we could be their working class. But there was a downside to that adaptation, and that was, well, you now need to cook your food. You will now need medications if you're not going to get sick. You will now need to live indoors and in a shelter, so on and so forth. So we've got both those storylines there in ancient story. Us being earthlings but having been adapted, or us having come from elsewhere and then being somewhat adapted to live on planet Earth. But certainly the Sumerian stories suggest that we, our ancestors, Homo sapiens sapiens, have been around for a very, very long time, for 200 to 300,000 years, and that we have been helped along the way in various ways. If we go to the Mesoamerican story, curated by the Mayan people and recovered in the book The Popol Vuh, which was produced in 1700 by a Dominican friar who translated a text that the Spanish thought they had burned into oblivion. Only one had survived, and the priest of the feathered serpents trusted Jimenez sufficiently to say, would you be interested in our story of beginnings? And they gave it to him, and he translated it. It was a story with a different explanation of human origins. And it said that the interference in life on Earth began before you get to Homo sapiens, that by the time you get to primates, there's already been artificial interventions in the development of life on Earth. And I mean, I hold to the view of panspermia, which is taken very seriously by DNA scientists around the world. It has been for a very long time. Francis Crick believed this, and he believed that the genetic coding for biological, conscious, intelligent life is as much a property of the cosmos as are the properties of light and gravity. And that means that whenever this genetic coding lands in an hospitable environment, it will generate forms of life similar to the ones that we're familiar with on planet Earth. So ultimately, it means all life in the cosmos is related. And so in that context, we have the Anunnaki turning up, or the Tingir turning up, or the feathered serpents turning up and saying, we can work with what's here, we're going to modify it. And that story of modification is the most common one, is more common than the seeding story. And again, the overlaps of those stories are really quite extraordinary. And if you ask the question, what am I being shown, and read those stories pictorially, it's easy to see Nigerian story, Mesoamerican story, Native American story, Australian story, Hebrew story, Sumerian story, as memories of a program of genetic modification of our ancestors. And it's one of the traumas that I mentioned before, how all these cultures, their stories overlap at the trauma points. And an experience of genetic modification is one of those traumas that overlaps.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Pierre. So we'll move on to Tom, because you're holding the mic.
Thank you, Paul. That was fabulous. I was here for the first talk that you gave to this group, and this one really built on that, because you gave us a great understanding of how the misinterpretation in the old texts was possible. You also have talked mainly about ancient things tonight, and I'm asking your take on a more modern subject. And you talked about the difference between the author of a text and the narrator of a text.
Yes.
And I'd like to ask about about whether you see any parallels in the way that the Bible has been reinterpreted in more modern times.
Can you say a bit more?
Well, in particular, I would ask about the Schofield version.
Go on.
You've talked about, clearly there's been narrative control being used around.
Yes.
That's our natural interpretation of what you said about the difference between the author and the narrator. Now,
yes.
The narrator is the church, presumably, but there are external influences.
Oh, I see what you mean.
As well.
Yes.
Can you give us more examples, more modern examples of how the Bible has been reinterpreted to suit a narrative?
Yes, okay. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Tom, for clarifying that. So the narrator and author thing was slightly different in the point I was making about Jeremiah, because we've got Jeremiah, the name of the book, Jeremiah, whoever the author was, and then Jeremiah, the narrator. And I'm saying that there may be some clear blue water between what the author thought and what the narrator is saying. When it comes to translations of the Bible, yes, there's another layer of things happening there. So you've got a spin that's been put by Jeremiah, and then you've got a redaction, of course, that's made as the Hebrew scriptures are cut and pasted, and then vocabulary imported into older texts to try and sew it all together. So the name Yahweh gets put into much older texts to make it all look like a book of Yahweh. So you've got that process with the Hebrew scriptures. And then the New Testament canon comes together. By the time we're talking about the Schofield Bible, of course, we're now thinking about, as you say, the church as the narrator, the church as the interpreter of the Bible, the church as the arbiter of translations. And so there's quite a famous shift in biblical translation in 1611 when King James personally intervened in translation choices being made in the letter of Ephesians in the New Testament, where the writer, which is another interesting question, so the writer, the Apostle Paul, or the person writing in his name, is saying that our struggle is against the rulers of this dark world. And the language he uses includes the language that we apply to secular princes and kings. And King James didn't want that. He didn't want to be associated with the wicked powers that run the world, that the Apostle Paul said is our real problem. And he commanded that that translation be changed so that it doesn't sound anything like Paul is getting us to worry about the human beings who are running the world. And so this is a direct interference by, well, a church authority. Yes, technically it was the king, so that we will read that text in a certain way where we spiritualize it all. And it's interesting to go back to the Greek and to ask, well, what do those Greek words mean? If we look at how they're used elsewhere, if we look at the root meanings, what was Paul more probably saying? And when we move away from the spiritualized religious way of reading that text, we're going to come away with lots of questions about not only how should we regard human elites, but who are these other powers in space that Paul references? And do they have anything in common with the authorities in space that Berossus talks about in the Babylonian telling? So that's a really interesting, knotty sort of translation moment. But of course, the church does more than decide which translations it likes and champions. It also decides what the story is it's going to preach. So, for instance, within the New Testament, you've got a reference to contact phenomena with beings that the writer calls spirits. And when we read the word spirit, we tend to think in the West of, oh, this is an incorporeal, spiritual, energy-based, non-physical kind of entity. Maybe it's an imagined entity, but if it exists, then it's one of these ethereal kind of things. That's not what ancient cultures often meant when they used the language of spirit. Often, if you see the word spirit as a translation of an ancient text from another culture, it's describing a being that you don't know how it got there and you don't know how it left. If you see something come down from the sky in a craft and leave in a craft, it's a spirit. If a person appears in your house with a message and then disappears, must have been a spirit. And the writer of 1 John is predicting encounters like this. And he's saying, don't trust everything they tell you and always test them. And if they're going to badmouth Jesus, don't pay any attention to them. And he's teaching his believers to maintain their own integrity and sovereignty when encountering these beings that he never explains what they are or where they've come from. Now, this is a text that for the most part, the church has not preached on. And in fact, for a long, long time, the Catholic Church preached against any kind of interpretation of a personal encounter experience. And there are portions of the church that define any anomalous experience as demonic. There's no such thing as a good spirit in a lot of churches, despite that text. Now, that's not gotten rid of by translation, it's gotten rid of by ignoring the text. And another example would be Hebrews chapter 12, which suggests that our deceased ancestors are very interested in our lives and are actually gathered around us to support us on our journey. Now, a lot of people believe this because they have experiences that suggest it to them, and it was clearly part of the primitive Christian experience as well, but you won't hear that preached in most churches. It's not been translated away, it's just been ignored. And so the church has really exercised great power in terms of how it's taught people to read the scriptures. But I think the most damaging thing the church has done, beyond spin, mistranslation, ignoring scriptures, is gaslighting people when they have legitimate questions. And children are full of legitimate questions about why would a God of love genocide the people he's made in a flood? Why would an intelligent God create a world with a devil in it or a serpent in it? Why would an intelligent God hold human beings responsible for decisions that they couldn't win in? You know, if you put Adam and Eve in a garden in total innocence and they don't have knowledge of good and evil, and then they do something you don't like, how can you hold them morally culpable and then punish them and all their descendants for eternity? Where's the justice in that? These are questions children answer. Or you come to, I mean, there's an amazing story. There's an amazing story in Leviticus 10 when the sons of Aaron, so this is the high priest working with Moses, the sons of Aaron take in an incense offering to Yahweh. The context of that is that the Elohim can all be calmed down by offerings of certain smells. Any human being coming into the presence of one of these Elohim has to be absolutely drenched in aromatic oils so that their smell won't offend the Elohim, and they will make incense offerings because it calms and sedates them. And one day, two sons of Aaron take an incense offering into Yahweh, and he doesn't like the smell, so he incinerates the two men. And when this happens, right in front of Moses and Aaron, Moses just says, Aaron, don't say anything. Don't breathe a word. I told you he was like this. And so we've got this story. If that story is read in a Sunday school class or is one of the morning readings at church, and a child says, why did God do that? How could a God of love do that? The chances are they're going to be gaslighted, and that if they can't love and worship a God who behaves like that, the problem is with them, not with God. And I think that's the most disturbing thing the church has done through the ages, that in order to have faith, you have to ignore and shut down your own conscience, because that way God can do all the wicked things that God does in the Bible. And of course, what I say in my books is these are not God's stories at all. That wasn't God who incinerated the sons of Aaron. It wasn't God who genocided people in a flood. It wasn't God who sent people to war. It wasn't God who was jealous of the leader of Ekron, so on and so forth. And the reason that so many believers don't see the blindingly obvious is they have been taught to ignore their own conscience. And I think that's the most damaging thing the church has done in its form of narrative control.
Great. Fascinating. Thank you so much, Paul. Okay, I'm going to get through here. Let's go to Julius.
Hello, Paul. Thank you very much.
Hi, Julius.
Very interesting and well presented interpretation of the historical artifacts. My question is, let's say there are ancient beings that came by and helped bootstrap humanity again, or maybe even helped create us in the first place. they must have known, just as we know now, that the knowledge itself might not be enough. You might also need a medium of preserving the knowledge. And how come that we are now forced to interpret signs or just, yeah, leftovers, and we were not taught how to preserve knowledge in a better way?
Mm, that's a really interesting question. That's a really interesting question. Well, if we listen to an ancestral story um, and take it at face value, then we were taught to farm. We were taught some things to do with medicine. We were taught some secrets of civil engineering, and we were taught some, how can I put it? Some of the tools that you will need if you're going to live in higher densities. So the Babylonians, for instance, say we were taught mathematics and money systems and writing for record keeping and banking. And that we were taught that in finite periods in the deep past. But the problem is that since that time, we have had quite deliberate campaigns to stamp even the memory of those periods of tuition out. So, for instance, I talked about Hezekiah and his successors wanting to stamp out the Jewish memory of that period of tuition. You can find other examples in Christian history where, for instance, the Portuguese and Spanish went into Central and South America and they wanted to delete and replace all the belief systems and authority structures and ministries of truth that existed there, replace libraries of books which they incinerated with the Bible and patterns of belief and worldview with the Bible and the Christian worldview and the teachings of the church. So a lot of stamping out of knowledge, not just to do with the beings who came, because, I mean, in the case of Mayan civilization, they had vast libraries of literature about all kinds of things, and goodness only knows what. I mean, we know some of what was in the Library of Alexandria. Who knows what may have been in the Mayan library? If it was an equivalent, then you've got cosmological information, civil engineering, mathematics, so on and so forth. And so there was a deliberate incinerating of knowledge right across the spectrum of human knowledge in Central and South America, which is a huge portion of the world, if you think about it. Similarly, in Africa, of course, the British did the same when they went into various African countries, delete and replace the local information with the news that the empire presents and the worldview of British Orthodox Anglican Christianity. And so I think we've lost a lot of information on a lot of fronts, not just information with regard to ancient visitors. Record keeping, well, I'm optimistic that we have a lot more records kept than we've yet discovered, because there's something like 300,000 cuneiform tablets waiting to be translated. I mean, the ones we have translated have been earth-shattering. The Artrahasis tablets, the Enuma Elish, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the myth of Adapa have overturned our understanding of the Bible and of God and of religion and of human origins. And that's just with the tiny portion of cuneiforms we've translated so far. So we may have a bit more in the records than we're yet aware of. But there's another aspect to this too, because I've talked about forgetting as a negative thing, an act of suppression. But when you listen to the elders of indigenous cultures who've maintained their ancient stories, if you go, for instance, to the Yolngu people and say, I'm very interested in why your deep ancestors didn't know how to live in that environment. Why didn't they know what they could eat and what they couldn't eat? Why didn't they know what plants should be avoided? Why didn't they know how to fish? What had happened? Had something happened to them, or had something happened to the environment? And the answer you'll be given is, we don't speak about that. And I think we don't speak about that, and you'll get that answer in other places too. I think sometimes the we don't speak about that is to do with trauma. We don't speak about the trauma that preceded the recovery that's reported in almost every creation narrative around the world. It's so interesting to me that what we call our creation stories always begin on a pre-existing planet that's been ruined. And there's a story of recovery. And so there's information that's been lost that way too, lost through trauma. And record keeping, well, I don't know. I do sometimes wonder if Pierre Boulle might have been onto something when he wrote Planet of the Apes, in which the apes were not allowed to know of the previous civilization, and artifacts were all secreted away so that they wouldn't know that the humans could once speak and had pistols and all that sort of thing. I do wonder, we have a pattern of burying knowledge. I mean, look at the documents that were buried for their protection in the Nag Hammadi for nearly 2,000 years. The Popol Vuh I mentioned before had been buried for 200 years to protect it from the Spanish. And I just wonder if there's other information out there waiting to be discovered for those reasons too.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Julius, for the question. So we just got a few short questions on Zoom, and I'm going to get Dennis here, who's managing the managing everything here today. So actually, I'll take this opportunity to say thank you, Dennis O'Connor and Awakening in Health, because he's doing all the video recording, the audio, and he's recording, editing, and putting it up on his channel later. So thank you, Dennis. Okay, so Dennis is going to read questions from Zoom if you're still okay, Paul. A little bit. You're still okay for time? Brilliant. Thank you.
Yes, I can keep going a little longer.
Okay.
Okay, Paul, thank you. Very, very interesting chat. I really appreciate you. First question from Chris is, do you think the Anunnaki moved through the other pantheons of gods under different names?
Oh, yeah, gosh, that really is a very interesting question. And very often people will ask me, oh, do I think Haldi, who's the senior Tingier of the Bianili, for instance, could he be Enki? Um, or was Yahweh Enlil? And we're wanting to put, where does Odin fit into the picture? It is possible that some of the advanced beings referenced in these ancient stories may have traveled around the world, may have been known in other places and known by other names. That's entirely possible. But what I find with the stories left behind is that you can't piece them together as if they're puzzle pieces to get the full picture. I certainly find that when I'm looking at the biblical story, Mesoamerican and Mesopotamian, they don't fit together that way. But what I do find is that themes will repeat, moments will repeat, events will repeat, particular agendas and conflicts will repeat, and these will fit together to provide a coherent picture. But character for character correspondences don't work, certainly between Mesoamerican, Mesopotamian, and biblical. And I find that more generally as well. So, Haldi, for instance, is a very localized being associated with ancient Armenia. Odin is a very localized being whose travels we can actually track if we observe the ancient stories. Um, so I haven't yet come across a case where I can say the story of N in culture A is the story of Z in culture B. That's not, though, to rule out the possibility of these advanced beings having traveled around the world. And certainly when you look at that period of the ecological reboot after the Younger Dryas Cold period, when agriculture had to be rebooted, the spread of that information happens with such rapidity that it has always fascinated archaeologists and people studying paleoagriculture. It is possible that those tutors traveled with that information. And I mean, some of these stories do suggest beings with flight technology. So, you know, when you look at the Assyrian pictures, you've got flying discs. The Urartian pictures have flying discs. The Vedic stories have kings with flying craft. So it made perfect sense that they could travel around and be known in different places, possibly by different names, but I just don't have the evidence to make those equations at this point.
Thank you.
Excuse me.
Thank you, Paul. You okay? We're good? Okay.
Okay, next question is from Simon. It appears to me that Jesus renounced Yahweh, and it appears to me that the Elohim introduced fish and meat to our diet. My research, along through scholars such as James Tabor, suggests that Jesus and the Nazarenes were vegetarians, and Jesus's teachings suggest that the Father, in brackets source, does not want sacrifice but mercy. I would like to ask if animal sacrifice has taken us away from natural law.
Yeah, animal sacrifice is much stranger in the Bible than is generally thought. So I think a lot of people have the idea that God demanded animal sacrifice as a sign of obedience, as a totemic way of giving him gifts, and that then the priests would eat the meat that was offered. And this was part of how the priests got paid. This is kind of just a conventional idea that people gossip around. It's not in the text at all. And what the Elohim wanted, including Yahweh, was for cows, bulls, and sheep to be burned so that he could inhale the smoke because it calmed him down. That's a very different way of understanding the purpose of animal sacrifice than the one that gets taught in the churches, but it is the story of the text. So for me, it's one of the great clues that we've got a memory of entities that are very different to us. And again, these are stories that it's very hard to find a reason to invent a story like that. And I mean, the story of Yahweh killing the sons of Aaron because they got the smell wrong. Again, it's very difficult to work out why you would invent a story like that. Again, it seems like an inconvenient cultural memory that it will never be forgotten. So it's got to be worked around in the story, and you've got to come away with it with some kind of a moral of the story that will make sense, except it never really can. So animal sacrifice, that's the real meaning of it there. And Jesus and Paul, I think, were both on the same page in trying to totally reframe the idea of sacrifice and the language of sacrifice so that in the New Testament, the sacrifice that God wants is that you look after widows and orphans and feed the hungry. The sacrifice that he wants is that you love your neighbor as yourself. And so they're doing their level best to totally neutralize the language of sacrifice. The early Christians were meat eaters, I would suggest, and I don't find any evidence in the Gospels, whether I'm talking about the Gnostic Gospels, the extra canonical Gospels, or the canonical ones, that Jesus wasn't a meat eater as well. So you might have to email me some things, Simon, if you've got some evidence that would put Jesus in that box. And I also think that the evidence is not strong for placing Jesus in the Nazarene sect, or him and his cousin among the Essenes, because there's a lot about those groups that we know that is in no way reflected in what we see of Jesus in the Gospels. So I remain to be convinced on that, but I'm not closed-minded to it. So if you've got some evidence you want to post me and send me down another rabbit hole, then absolutely feel free to do that, Simon. But I don't have anything that really I can bounce back on those topics for you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question. Thank you, Paul. So we have one last question on Zoom from our American friend Bill Birch in the US.
Okay, the question goes as
Oh,
follows.
by the way, I would, Joe, though, before Simon goes away from the mic, want to affirm the first part of what you said 100%. And this is again something that the church has not avoided by mistranslating. It's avoided simply by avoiding it, not preaching on the text closely. Yes, absolutely. There was a discontinuity between the laws of Yahweh and the teachings of Jesus. And I think Jesus very clearly in John 8, for instance, identifies Yahweh as not his God and Father, and identifies his own Father as someone and something unknown to the people he's preaching to, including his 12. And the gospel writers have to do a very difficult thing, because they want to show Jesus as affirming the Yahwist tradition, affirming the Mosaic tradition, and then deleting and replacing it with something totally different. And that's why we have the moment of the transfiguration, where in effect Moses is handing the baton over to Jesus, so that the reader can say, great, we can dispense with the laws of Yahweh, and we're now going to do the Jesus thing. And that discontinuity is reflected in a verse like Colossians 2:14, that talks about the law being cancelled by Jesus. And it's reflected by the decision of the church in Acts 15 to dispense with all the laws of Yahweh and simply to avoid meat that's been sacrificed to idols, which suggests that other meat is okay, to come back to the other point. But I just wanted to get that in, Simon. I do agree with you. It's a story of discontinuity. I may need to pause shortly because I have a cold and my throat's beginning to expire.
Okay, thank you. Sorry to keep you up. Is it a short question?
Yeah, it looks
Okay, so you take a big swig of water. We'll come with the last question from Bill Birch in the US.
Okay, the question is as follows. Pleiades is 440 light years away, meaning a trip would take 160,000 years moving at the speed of light. Are you suggesting their arrival, corresponds to our problem or problems, and then they pop home? If they left, they just
Yes.
got back literally just now, is a statement after the question.
Yes, exactly. I think if we're approaching this through Newtonian science, it doesn't work at all, because by the time any observer from the Pleiades says, oh my goodness, they've got an ice age coming on, it will have come and gone. So the only way any of these stories make sense if wormhole travel, something of that kind, is possible, where you don't travel a long space, you travel through a shortcut. That's the only thing that makes sense of interstellar visitors. There has to be some way of getting through the universe that isn't linear travel across the fabric of space. The reason I'm persuaded that that must be possible is because of the very strong evidence of contact in the present. And that's what I cover in, if I can find it, here we are, in The Invasion of Eden. If you are agnostic on the question of whether we've had contact with other civilizations, that's the book I'd recommend of mine, The Invasion of Eden, because there I will give you a paper trail to follow of things that have been disclosed not only by representatives of US military intelligence, but by people around the world involved in the legacy program, which is the analysis of metamaterials obtained from UFO retrievals. Ed Mitchell, who was the sixth man to walk on the moon, said, if anyone is skeptical that we've been in contact, the white rabbit you want to follow is UFO retrievals. And he said that all through the decades. What has happened in the last, what would it be now? 8 years has been a phenomenal acceleration of disclosure of information regarding the analysis of those materials. So I would say just Google David Grush, Google the Congressional House hearing of July the 26th, 2023. Google Hayam Eshed, the Brigadier General who for 28 years was Israel's Chief of Space Security. Google the previous Prime Minister of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev. Google the previous Chief of French Intelligence, Alain Juillet. Listen to what they say about what's being studied. Listen to eminent physicists such as Jacques Vallée, who is one of the scientists working for one of our aerospace corporations now to analyze these materials, and Eric W. Davies, an American astrophysicist, Google him. I think if you follow that white rabbit, I would be very surprised if you come away thinking that we're not in contact. And as soon as you form that conclusion, the question changes from how could they possibly get here to how did they get here? And once you're on that page, you start to review the old stories a little bit differently. They have their own language for talking about subspace travel, and I hinted that with the language of the Nous, that this was a form of travel that was not, a straight line from A to B. This was somebody appearing from another realm through a way that you couldn't possibly describe or understand. The whole language, as I say, of spirit has been created by some cultures to explain beings that you have no way of understanding or describing how they got here and how they left. And I think we could certainly say that of anyone who turns up, pings into our airspace. If you Google the Tic Tac encounters from 2004, listen to the testimony of the pilots who engaged with those, and they talk about this pinging into our airspace and pinging out of it. And again, that suggests we're doing something other than linear travel. So if you are of a view that linear travel is the only travel possible, then you can rule all these stories of contact and intervention out. I would absolutely agree with you. But our ancestors have these stories of intervention, and there's a paper trail to follow in the present. So The Invasion of Eden is the book to read if you want to go that route.
Thank you so much, Paul. I think we're going to let you go here. I'm sure there are many questions, but you need your sleep and you need to recover from your cold. So a big hand from everybody in the room. Thank you, everybody on Zoom. And so Paul, if you send me the stuff, like the website, I've posted to everybody. On your website, you have a list of all of your books, correct?
Yes. So if you go to paulanthonywallis.com and go to the tile on the homepage, it says Buy Paul's Books. They're all listed in order, so you can see the order of the Eden series. But all the different books are on the homepage as well, and they all stand alone. So you don't have to read the whole series if you don't want to. You can just find the one that's asking the question you're interested in.
Thank you. And I just do have one little personal question. So in all of your books, Eden, the key operative word seems to be Eden. In your mind, short answer is fine. What is Eden?
Well, we think of Eden as a paradise, don't we? In a place of innocence. a place of beginnings. And so the first book in the series, Escaping from Eden, ought to be a puzzle. Why would you want to escape from Eden? But when we get into the root meanings of the key words, when we read the biblical stories alongside the Mesopotamian stories, we realize we're actually reading a story that has a lot of trauma in it and is not the story we thought. It's not a story of creation, it's a story of rehabilitation. It's not a story of Homo sapiens being created out of nothing. It's a story about our ancestors being interfered with. And so there's a story of light and shade in Eden that I bring out in that book. And once I'd written Escaping from Eden, I realized this was a good motif to continue with because you can do so much with it. So we've got the scars of Eden. How can you have scars from paradise? And so there's always some kind of a how do these words go together in the title that I hope will intrigue people and make people pick the book up and have a look.
Absolutely intrigued me enough to ask you the question, so it's working. Okay, thank you very much, Paul Wallis. I appreciate it. Everybody, another round of applause. Thank you to everyone on Zoom for tuning in. And Paul, we will definitely check out your website, and we hope to have
Great.
you back again. Thank you very
Thanks,
much.
everyone. Thanks, everyone, for being here, and it's been a real pleasure.
Big wave, everybody. Thank you very much, Paul, and good night. Good night to
All
everyone.
right, all the best.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.